The camera sweeps across Hollywood Boulevard on a warm California night. Neon signs blaze, limousines glide past, and paparazzi flashbulbs explode as stars step onto red carpets in shimmering gowns. The 1970s glittered with glamour, and from the outside, it looked like paradise. Actresses were adored, envied, and idolized. Their lives seemed golden. But behind the sequins and stage smiles, another reality was quietly unfolding. In the back corners of nightclubs, in hushed studio offices, and in gossip magazine columns, whispers followed certain women, not about their performances, but about who they might secretly love. The 1970s were the age of the sexual revolution, feminism, and breaking rules. Yet Hollywood remained a fortress of conservatism. The studios still pulled strings, carefully polishing the images of their stars. Contracts often contain morality clauses. A single rumor of a lesbian affair could damage reputations, cost roles, and reduce a woman's career to dust. The spotlight illuminated fame, but it also burned away any margin for error. So these actresses learned to live double lives. Some smiled for cameras beside male co-stars while their real partners stayed in the shadows. Some allowed gossip to swirl but never confirmed anything, turning rumor into a kind of armor. Others buried their truth so deeply that the world wouldn't discover them until decades later, long after the applause had faded. It was a paradox. America in the 70s claimed to celebrate freedom, yet women in Hollywood could not be free in the most basic way. Free to love openly. Men could misbehave, rack up scandals, and often be forgiven. Women were expected to be flawless, glamorous, and above all, heterosexual. To step outside that expectation was to risk everything. Imagine the loneliness of that existence. Accepting awards without being able to thank the person who meant the most. Walking red carpets with men chosen for publicity, while the real love of your life waited at home, unnamed. Building a career around being desirable to men, when in truth, your heart belonged elsewhere. And yet, these women endured. They worked, they created, they inspired. Some kept their lives compartmentalized, never speaking publicly about what everyone around them quietly knew. Others left coded clues in their art, their fashion, or the company they kept. Their resilience was extraordinary. They lived in the shadow of secrecy, but they refused to let that secrecy erase them. Some women loved bravely but quietly. Others buried their truths beneath layers of publicity photos and scripted interviews. And yet, their stories linger, whispered, half-confirmed, and hidden in plain sight. This isn't a story of outing or scandal. It's a story of survival. It's about 7 women who carry the burden of Hollywood's silence while still leaving behind legacies that shape culture and art. Their lives remind us that the struggle for acceptance is not new. It was being fought even in the golden glow of the 1970s. And that's where our journey begins. These are not just stars. They are women who balance the weight of fame with the weight of secrecy. Their careers lit up the screen, but their private truths had to stay hidden behind the velvet curtain. So let's pause the music, dim the lights, and step off the red carpet for a moment. In the quiet, away from the noise of flashing cameras, we find the real stories. Stories of love, fear, and resilience. Stories that Hollywood never wanted to tell. And our first begins with a woman whose comedy defined the decade, and whose love story, though invisible to the world then, stands today as one of the most enduring in Hollywood. The 1970s were a golden decade for comedy, and few stars shone brighter than Lily Tomlin. Born in Detroit, Tomlin's rise to fame was not the typical Hollywood fairy tale of a glamorous ingenue plucked from obscurity. Instead, she carved a path through sharp wit, fearless originality, and a knack for creating characters that audiences could never forget. Her breakthrough came on the hit sketch comedy show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The series was a cultural phenomenon, a mix of slapstick, satire, and rapid-fire jokes that captured the anarchic spirit of the late 60s and early 70s. Among the many faces on that crowded stage, Tomlin stood out. She introduced characters that became instantly iconic. Ernestine, the snorting, sarcastic telephone operator with a nasal twang, and Edith, and the precocious 5-year-old who delivered worldly wisdom from an oversized rocking chair. With just a wig, a voice, and a posture, Tomlin could transform herself completely. Audiences roared, critics applauded, and suddenly, this woman with a distinctly offbeat sensibility was America's new comedy darling. But Tomlin wasn't content to stay in the box of television sketch comedy. In 1975, she took a leap onto the big screen in Robert Altman's Nashville, a sprawling ensemble drama that redefined what a Hollywood film could be. Playing Linnea Reese, a gospel singer navigating personal and family struggles, Tomlin stunned critics with her subtle, soulful performance. The Academy noticed, too. She earned an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress. For a comedian, and especially a female comedian, to make such a seamless transition into serious drama was rare. Tomlin had proven she could do it all. Behind the spotlight, though, another story was quietly unfolding. In 1971, Tomlin met Jane Wagner, a writer whose keen intelligence and sensitivity immediately struck a chord. Their partnership began professionally. Wagner helped give depth to Tomlin's comedy, writing material that played to her strengths while expanding her range. But as the scripts piled up, so did the emotions. The two women fell in love. In private, their relationship was steady, affectionate, and enduring. Among friends and collaborators, it was no secret who Tomlin came home to at the end of the day. But to the outside world, it was an unspoken truth. Hollywood was not ready for an openly lesbian couple at the center of its industry. Executives often issued warnings couched as friendly advice. Being too open about her personal life, they suggested, could end her chances at leading roles. The same studios that laughed at her sketches worried that audiences wouldn't laugh or cry if they knew the truth. There was always a threat of typecasting, of being reduced to a single identity, of being shoved into the margins rather than allowed to thrive in the center. Tomlin had a choice to make, deny the whispers outright or walk a delicate tightrope. She chose discretion. She never publicly denied her truth, but she never announced it either. When asked about her personal life, she smiled, redirected, or gave answers so layered with wit that they could be read in more than one way. It was a balancing act, keeping her work authentic and groundbreaking, while keeping her private life off-limit from a press corps eager to pounce on scandal. What made her balancing act remarkable was how she managed to stay herself within the confines of Hollywood restrictions. Her comedy was always infused with compassion for outsiders, misfits, and underdogs, characters who, like Tomlin herself, didn't quite fit into the expected mold. Ernestine, the telephone operator, was hilariously pushy and unapologetically odd. Edith Ann, in her oversized rocking chair, spoke truth that adults didn't want to hear. Audiences laughed. But beneath the laughter was recognition. Tomlin was holding up a mirror to society's hypocrisies. Those who knew her best often remarked that her comedy carried a coded honesty about who she was and how she saw the world. To friends, the love between Tomlin and Wagner was obvious, tender, and unwavering. To the press, it remained speculation. And to fans, most of whom were unaware of the truth, she was simply Lily, the brilliant comedian, the actress who could make you laugh and cry in the same breath. Looking back, Tomlin's journey in the 1970s offers a striking example of how queer women navigated Hollywood's minefield. She and Wagner built a private sanctuary of partnership and creativity while maintaining a public image polished enough to survive the industry's scrutiny. It wasn't the freedom the era's rhetoric promised, but it was survival. And survival, in its own way, was resistance. By the time the decade closed, Tomlin stood as one of the most versatile performers of her generation. She had conquered television, crossed into film, and developed a comedy style that was both popular and profound. But behind those achievements was a quieter victory, the preservation of a love story that would endure for decades, long past the era when it had to be hidden. Her story in the 1970s reminds us that courage doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience, partnership, and the ability to keep creating in a world that wants to limit you. Lily Tomlin never denied who she was, but she also refused to let Hollywood's silence define her. And in doing so, she became not just a star of her time, but a beacon for generations who would follow. When audiences first encountered Sandy Dennis, they were struck not by glamour but by something far rarer in Hollywood, vulnerability. She was the actress who made awkwardness magnetic, who brought fragility and eccentricity into sharp, unforgettable focus. In a town that celebrated polished beauty and perfectly rehearsed smiles, Dennis leaned into the offbeat, and for that, she became one of the most distinctive performers of her generation. Her breakthrough came in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, 1966. Edward Albee's explosive drama brought to the screen with a cast led by Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Amid the fireworks of those two titans, Dennis played Honey, the fragile and naive young wife caught in the crossfire of verbal warfare. Where another actress might have faded into the background, Dennis stood out. She gave Honey layers of nervous energy, awkward charm, and emotional truth. For that performance, she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. It was a remarkable feat, her first major film role, and she walked away with an Oscar. From there, Dennis carved a niche for herself. She played characters who were odd, delicate, and unpredictable, roles other actresses might have avoided. Her performances in films like Up the Down Staircase, 1967, and Sweet November, 1968, made it clear that she had no interest in being Hollywood's next blonde bombshell or girl next door. She was interested in the women on the margins, the ones who didn't fit the mold. Off-screen, however, Dennis remained just as unconventional. She rarely discussed her personal life and refused to play the part of the Hollywood starlet. While gossip magazines feasted on the romances of her peers, Dennis kept her private world sealed. She lived with dozens of cats, famously doting on them as if they were her true companions. She cultivated a fiercely independent lifestyle, which left columnists puzzled. Without the standard narrative of a glamorous marriage or a string of leading men, rumors naturally began to swirl. Speculation followed her throughout her career, whispers of close relationships with women, observations that she avoided the traditional image of femininity promoted by the studios. None of it was ever confirmed, and Dennis herself never addressed the gossip directly. Instead, she lived as she pleased, eccentric, private, unapologetically outside the lines. Hollywood, however, didn't quite know what to do with her. In a system that thrived on predictability, Sandy Dennis refused to be predictable. She didn't show up polished on magazine covers. She didn't court the tabloids with carefully orchestrated romances. She didn't appear to care about cultivating a mainstream image at all. And in the process, she gained a reputation among gossip writers as strange, unmarriageable, even difficult. To some, her bohemian habits and reluctance to play the Hollywood game made her an outsider. To others, that very strangeness was what made her fascinating. Dennis's reclusiveness was not a retreat so much as a statement. She wasn't going to bend herself into the shape the industry demanded. She wasn't going to sell a fantasy of glossy perfection. In that sense, she was living authentically, though always without the public admission of what that authenticity truly meant. The rumors about her sexuality, while never substantiated, became part of the mystery that surrounded her. There's an irony in Dennis's story. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she wasn't boxed in by Hollywood's obsession with conventional beauty. She wasn't hired because she embodied a man's fantasy. She was hired because she could make characters breathe, twitch, unravel, and break your heart. That gave her freedom, but it also isolated her. Without the protection of Hollywood's glossy machinery, she stood exposed to gossip she had no interest in refuting. The 1970s added layers to this paradox. As her contemporaries continued to chase stardom, Dennis leaned further into her eccentricities. She became almost mythic, the Oscar-winning actress who avoided Hollywood bright lights in favor of a quieter, more peculiar existence. She worked steadily, appearing in films, television, and stage productions, but always on her own terms. What remained striking about Sandy Dennis is that she did not appear to struggle with the same inner conflict as some of her peers. She didn't put on a public performance of heterosexuality, nor did she attempt to erase speculation. She simply ignored it. In a sense, that too was an act of rebellion. To live without explanation in a world demanding constant justification was its own kind of defiance. By the end of the 1970s, Dennis's career was less about Hollywood stardom and more about carving out a space where she could exist as herself, quirky, private, and unbothered by the expectations of others. She left behind a legacy that feels refreshingly honest. She was an actress who never fit the mold, who never pretended to, and who was willing to be seen as strange rather than false. She may never have spoken publicly about the whispers surrounding her personal life, but the life she chose speaks volumes. Sandy Dennis stands as an example of what it meant to survive Hollywood without surrendering to its rules, a woman who lived outside its norms, built a career on authenticity, and reminded us that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to simply be yourself, no explanations offered. If Hollywood had a patron saint of misfits, Susan Tyrrell would have worn the crown. From the moment she appeared on screen, it was clear she didn't belong to the polished world of ingenues or starlets. Tyrrell thrived in the shadows, finding beauty in the raw, the broken, and the unrefined. Where other actresses played glamour, she played grit. And in the 1970s, that grit earned her one of the most unforgettable reputations in film. Her most celebrated role came in 1972, when director John Huston cast her in Fat City, a bleak but poetic drama about small-time boxers chasing fading dreams. Tyrrell played Oma, a hard-drinking, desperate barfly whose rough edges masked a reservoir of loneliness. It was a performance that scorched itself into audiences' memories, messy, tender, and painfully real. For it, Tyrrell earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. Suddenly, this wild, unpredictable actress was recognized as one of the era's most daring talents. But Tyrrell's career was never built on awards or mainstream success. She gravitated to roles that others might have turned down, characters who were too strange, too tragic, or too abrasive for Hollywood-safe formulas. Films like Cry Baby, 1990, and Forbidden Zone, 1980, showcase her appetite for the bizarre, cementing her cult status. Even when her name wasn't on billboards, Susan Tyrrell commanded respect among those who valued authenticity over artifice. Off-screen, her life was every bit as bohemian as her role suggested. Tyrrell lived loudly, defiantly, and without apology. Friends recalled her as a woman who thrived on the fringes of society, throwing herself into art, music, and excess. She was known to embrace chaos with a wink, drinking hard, partying harder, and never pretending to be anything other than what she was. In her world, eccentricity wasn't an act, it was survival. That fearlessness extended to her private relationships. Though she rarely discussed her love life publicly, whispers in Hollywood linked her with women as well as men. Friends often described her as fluid, unconcerned with labels, and utterly unafraid of exploring her desires. In an industry where most actresses hid their true selves, Tyrrell seemed to delight in being impossible to pin down. But even she had limits. Hollywood in the 1970s was not forgiving to women who lived too far outside the lines, especially when it came to sexuality. Tyrrell never stood on a stage and declared her truth outright. She played her cards close, sometimes letting gossip swirl unchecked, other times sidestepping questions with a laugh. Perhaps she knew that a direct acknowledgement could cost her what little stability her career offered. Or perhaps she simply enjoyed the mystery, letting the world guess while she lived on her own terms. What set Tyrrell apart was her refusal to be polished. Where contemporaries carefully cultivated an image of glamour and accessibility, she leaned into the grotesque and the outrageous. She didn't want to be America's sweetheart. She wanted to be unforgettable. And in that sense, she embodied the misfit spirit of the 1970s better than almost anyone. Hollywood thrives on conformity. Susan Tyrrell thrived on rejecting it. While many actresses of her time navigated the constant fear of being outed or typecast, Tyrrell made eccentricity her armor. Her sexuality, while never confirmed, was woven into the larger tapestry of a life lived on society's edges. She may have concealed details, but she never concealed her essence. There's a particular freedom in not caring whether you fit the mold. Tyrrell embodied that freedom. She could play a drunken barfly or a carnival oddity with the same ferocity she brought to her private life. Every choice she made, on screen and off, was a refusal to bend to Hollywood's expectations. And while that may have limited her mainstream career, it also made her unforgettable. By the close of the 1970s, Susan Tyrrell wasn't a household name in the way some of her contemporaries were. But to those who valued authenticity, she stood as a kind of icon. She represented a different version of womanhood, unvarnished, passionate, unruly, and defiantly different. Her story reminds us that not every Hollywood journey was about playing by the rules or chasing box office success. For some, like Tyrrell, it was about survival, rebellion, and carving out a space where truth, however messy, could shine through. In the end, Susan Tyrrell left behind a body of work that remains as jagged and fascinating as a woman herself. She was a performer who dared to live as boldly as she acted, whose life blurred the lines between art and chaos. And though she never stood in the spotlight and declared her secrets, her very existence was a kind of declaration that beauty can be found in the broken, that love is bigger than labels, and that sometimes the misfit is the truest star of all. Few actresses of the 20th century embodied Hollywood glamour quite like Angie Dickinson. With her smoky eyes, hunted voice, and effortless allure, she became the kind of star who made both audiences and studios swoon. By the late 1950s, Dickinson had established herself as one of Hollywood's most recognizable sex symbols, thanks in part to her role in Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo, 1959, where she played Feathers opposite John Wayne. The film made her a star, not because she embodied innocence or domesticity, but because she radiated an unapologetic sensuality. Through the 1960s and into the 70s, Dickinson built on that image. She played women who were smart, glamorous, and desirable, whether in big-budget films or stylish thrillers. By the time she headlined the television series Policewoman in the 1970s, she had become one of the first women to anchor successful crime drama. Her role as Sgt. Pepper Anderson made her a pioneer, an actress leading a gritty, action-packed series at a time when few women carried shows on their shoulders. But even here, her sex appeal was part of the package. Audiences were reminded, week after week, that she was as much an object of desire as a figure of authority. Her public life only added to the allure. Dickinson's name was linked to some of the biggest male stars of the era, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and even whispers about presidents. She was photographed in the arms of powerful men, and the gossip columns made her out to be the ultimate Hollywood dream girl, independent, glamorous, and forever desired by the most eligible bachelors. But beneath the surface, another set of whispers followed her. For all the headlines about Sinatra and Martin, there were quieter rumors about Dickinson's relationships with women. Hollywood insiders speculated, journalists occasionally probed, but whenever the subject came up, Dickinson brushed the questions aside. She denied, deflected, or allowed the silence to close in. The image of a sex symbol was too valuable, too carefully constructed, to risk cracking open. That pressure weighed heavily on actresses like Dickinson. Being a sex symbol wasn't just about being admired. It was about being desired by men specifically. Her marketability, her career opportunities, even the role she was offered depended on the illusion of heterosexual availability. The entire structure of her stardom rested on the assumption that men could imagine her as theirs. To acknowledge attraction to women, even in passing, would have been to risk shattering the brand she had spent decades building. This contradiction defined much of Dickinson's 1970s career. On one hand, she was a public embodiment of heterosexual fantasy, glamorous gowns, tabloid-ready romances, a face on magazine covers. On the other hand, the private whispers painted a more complex picture, one in which her intimate connections did not always match the fantasy being sold. Whether those whispers were exaggerated or not, their very existence reveals a paradox of Hollywood stardom in that era. A woman's image was not her own, but a product managed, packaged, and fiercely protected. The 1970s was supposed to be a time of liberation. The women's movement was reshaping culture, and television was pushing boundaries with stories of independent women. Dickinson herself, through Policewoman, was part of that change, showing audiences that a woman could be both tough and glamorous. And yet, the boundaries of her personal image were as tightly drawn as ever. Liberation could be played on screen, but it could not yet be lived openly off-screen. Looking back, Dickinson's story feels like a case study in the cost of Hollywood branding. She was immensely talented, able to command both drama and comedy, film and television. She was a trailblazer in action-oriented roles for women. But her legacy was forever entangled with the image of heterosexual desirability, an image that left little room for nuance, authenticity, or truth. It is impossible to know the full reality of Dickinson's private life, and perhaps that is as she wanted it. But what we do know is that the whispers, the denials, and the careful maintenance of her image illustrate the suffocating choices faced by women of her generation. To live openly was to risk career suicide. To remain silent was to live half a truth. For Angie Dickinson, the 1970s were her peak. A glamorous icon, a groundbreaking television star, a woman whose name carried weight in Hollywood. But her story also reflected the hidden rules of the system she thrived in, a system that insisted women be branded as heterosexual fantasy objects, regardless of who they really were. And that's the legacy she leaves in this context. Not just the shining roles and the dazzling red carpet appearances, but also the reminder how much actresses were forced to conceal in order to survive. In Angie Dickinson, we see both the glamour and the cage, the woman Hollywood presented to the world, and the quieter truths that demanded she keep hidden. By the 1970s, Marlene Dietrich was no longer a working actress but a legend. Her Hollywood career had begun in the early 1930s, when a performance in The Blue Angel, 1930, made her an international sensation. Through the decade that followed, she built a reputation as one of the most glamorous and enigmatic stars in the world. By the time the 70s arrived, Dietrich had already retired from the screen, but her influence remained everywhere, in fashion, in film, and in the cultural imagination. She was not merely a performer, she was an icon. Dietrich's reputation had always been entangled with mystery, particularly when it came to her sexuality. Long before the public conversation about queerness had any real space in Hollywood, Dietrich was quietly cultivating her own reputation as a woman who loved boldly and without restriction. Throughout her career, she was linked with men of great power and fame, actors, producers, political figures, but there were also persistent whispers of her relationships with women. Among those rumored companions were some of the most famous names of the 20th century, actress Greta Garbo, poet and playwright Mercedes de Acosta, and various European aristocrats. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Dietrich did not go out of her way to silence these rumors. She never gave interviews confirming them, but she didn't rush to deny them either. In that silence, she allowed speculation to become part of her mystique. The public could wonder, gossip columnists could imply, and still Dietrich maintained her carefully crafted persona, untouchable, alluring, and larger than life. Her art itself often hinted at truths Hollywood could not acknowledge openly. Dietrich was famous for her androgynous style. She wore men's suits long before it was fashionable, not only on stage but also in her everyday life. In the early 1930s, she scandalized audiences by appearing in tuxedos, tailored trousers, and top hats, blurring the lines between masculine and feminine presentation. At a time when women were expected to conform to rigid standards of beauty and dress, Dietrich made gender fluidity glamorous. She went even further in performance. On stage, she was known to kiss women in front of live audiences, a provocative act that was equal parts performance art and personal statement. These gestures electrified her fans and horrified her critics, cementing her reputation as a star who lived by her own rules. Even in the conservative climate of mid-20th century Hollywood, Dietrich found ways to challenge the system, not through speeches or activism, but through style, presence, and daring acts of visibility. By the 1970s, her days of making headlines as a working actress were over, but her influence only deepened. Younger generations of artists and performers look back at Dietrich as a pioneer, a woman who had smuggled queer aesthetics into mainstream culture under the guise of glamour. She never labeled herself, never confirmed the relationships the gossip columns insisted were true. But in refusing to play by Hollywood rules of silence and denial, she created space for something revolutionary, the possibility that stardom could contain multitudes. Dietrich's impact in this era wasn't about scandal, it was about legacy. By embodying gender-bending fashion and unapologetic sensuality, she helped shape a cultural vocabulary that extended beyond Hollywood. Designers borrowed from her wardrobe. Musicians cited her as an influence. Artists copied her image. The lines she blurred in the 1930s remained relevant in the 1970s, a time when gender roles were once again being challenged. Her decision to let rumors swirl without comment became, in hindsight, a deliberate form of power. Hollywood in the 1970s still punished women for stepping too far outside the heterosexual script. But Dietrich had built a career so commanding that she didn't need to explain herself. She lived privately, but her art and her image spoke loudly enough. She made silence into a weapon, using mystery to protect herself while still signaling a refusal to conform. There is something profoundly modern about Dietrich's legacy. Even in an era when authenticity was often impossible for queer women in Hollywood, she managed to carve out a space where queerness was visible, stylish, and powerful. She did not speak the words out loud, but she let the world see enough to know. And in doing so, she created a blueprint for artists who came after her, those who would challenge gender, sexuality, and identity more openly in decades to come. By the close of the 1970s, Marlene Dietrich was more myth than mortal, a figure who had transcended time and place. Her films remain classics, her photographs timeless, her image indelible. And woven into that myth was a subtle but undeniable presence of queerness, not confessed, not denied, but lived through art, fashion, and a refusal to be categorized. Dietrich's story is not simply about secrecy. It is about how a woman used glamour as armor, performance as confession, and silence as power. In a Hollywood that demanded conformity, she stood as proof that mystery could be more radical than revelation. Even in her quiet years, her presence haunted the industry, reminding it that identity cannot always be contained, and that beauty, in all its forms, defies the boxes we try to place it in. By the 1970s, Joan Crawford stood as one of the last surviving titans of Hollywood's golden age. Her career had spanned nearly 5 decades, beginning in the silent era and evolving through talkies, melodramas, and eventually into the cult classics that defined her later years. She was, by then, more than an actress. She was a mythic figure, an emblem of reinvention and resilience. From flapper ingenue in the 1920s to Oscar-winning star in Mildred Pierce, 1945, Crawford's story was one of survival in an industry that devoured women once they aged out of ingenue status. By the time the 1970s arrived, Crawford had largely retreated from the screen. Her final film, Trog, 1970, was a low-budget curiosity that disappointed her fans and embarrassed her personally. After that, she withdrew from Hollywood life, making only sporadic public appearances. Yet even in semi-retirement, her presence was unmistakable. Crawford had already secured her place as one of the most iconic stars in American cinema, a woman whose face, style, and ferocity were carved into Hollywood cultural memory. But along with her cinematic triumphs came an equally enduring set of rumors about her personal life. Gossip had swirled around Crawford for decades, hinting at affairs with women both inside and outside the industry. The whispers suggested she had relationships not just with fellow actresses but also with behind-the-scenes figures, costume designers, secretaries, and women in the Hollywood power network who operated away from the glare of the spotlight. While no confirmation ever came directly from Crawford, the persistence of these stories spoke volumes. In the old Hollywood system, studios dictated nearly every aspect of a star's image. Contracts often included morality clauses, designed to protect the carefully constructed personas that sold tickets. For Crawford, whose on-screen persona was often fiercely independent yet undeniably feminine, being associated with same-sex relationships would have been dangerous. In an industry where even a whisper of queerness could derail a career, secrecy wasn't just a choice, it was survival. Crawford's silence on these matters fit neatly into the culture of her era. In interviews, she always performed the role expected of her, glamorous, self-possessed, and appropriately flirtatious when speaking of her male co-stars. Yet behind the curtain, her life may have been far more complex. Friends and biographers have debated for years the extent of her relationships with women, with some pointing to her intimate friendships as evidence of something deeper. Whether true or not, the persistence of these rumors speaks to how powerfully Crawford embodied a different kind of femininity, one that wasn't easily confined to heterosexual narratives. What makes Crawford's story particularly striking is the way she balanced immense power with profound vulnerability. She was, in many respects, a self-made woman, someone who clawed her way up from poverty in Texas to the peak of Hollywood stardom. She reinvented herself multiple times, navigating the ruthless shift of an industry that discarded women after a certain age. In public, she projected absolute control, her immaculate fashion, her commanding presence, her refusal to be diminished. But even she was not beyond the reach of Hollywood's narrow norms. To maintain her power, she had to play by rules designed to keep women, especially queer women, silent. By the 1970s, Crawford's legacy had already become complicated. Her feud with Bette Davis, immortalized in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, 1962, had become legend. Her personal life, marked by 4 marriages and a famously tumultuous relationship with her adopted children, only added to her enigmatic reputation. Yet within this storm of public fascination, the rumors of her attraction to women endured, hinting at a private life the public never fully saw. In many ways, Crawford exemplifies the contradictions of Hollywood itself. She was a woman who wielded immense star power, who shaped her career with ruthless determination, and who outlasted countless rivals. Yet even she remained constrained by the industry's moral codes, forced to hide or deflect any suggestion of queerness. Her life shows how even the most commanding women of Hollywood could not fully escape the shadows of secrecy. By the time of her death in 1977, Joan Crawford had become both revered and polarizing, a star who symbolized Hollywood glamour at its most dazzling and its most punishing. In the years since, the rumors about her private life have become part of a legend, fueling biographies, documentaries, and endless speculation. For some, these stories complicate her image. For others, they enrich it, revealing the possibility that Crawford lived her life on her own terms, at least in private, even if the public never knew. Her story, in the context of queer Hollywood history, is one of both triumph and silence. She triumphed by achieving what few actresses ever could, a career that spanned eras, a name that remains instantly recognizable. But her silence, whether chosen or imposed, reflects the suffocating pressures of her time. Crawford represents the paradox of queer women in old Hollywood: immense power in front of the camera, profound vulnerability behind it. And so, as the 1970s closed in on her, Joan Crawford left behind a legacy both unshakable and unresolved. She was the ultimate star, a master of reinvention, a woman who lived for image and performance. Yet the whispers of her hidden loves remind us that even the strongest stars were forced to navigate a world that could not yet allow them to be fully themselves. Crawford's story is a reminder that power in Hollywood was always conditional, and that authenticity, for women like her, came at too high a price. As we reach the end of this story, the through line connecting these women becomes unmistakable. They came from different backgrounds, played different roles, and moved through Hollywood with their own distinctive styles. Lily Tomlin's sharp wit, Sandy Dennis's quiet eccentricity, Susan Tyrrell's raw defiance, Angie Dickinson's glamour, Marlene Dietrich's daring, and Joan Crawford's iron will. Yet despite their differences, the common thread running through their lives was silence. Secrecy, discretion, and coded identity were not optional choices but strategies for survival. The 1970s promised liberation. Culturally, it was an era of revolution. Disco clubs thrilled with music, second-wave feminism was rewriting rules, and the sexual revolution seemed to make anything possible. But Hollywood was not nearly as free as the world around it. The studios still clung to their rigid morality clauses. Publicists carefully polished stars into marketable illusions. A whisper of lesbian desire, a single rumor that gained traction, could mean lost contracts, fewer leading roles, or total career collapse. For actresses, especially those branded as sex symbols, the stakes were even higher. Their professional lives often hinged on maintaining a heterosexual fantasy for audiences and executives alike. To admit to loving women, even privately, even indirectly, was to risk tearing down the entire scaffolding on which their careers were built. It's no wonder, then, that so many of these women lived in a careful gray area, rumors unconfirmed, glances that said more than words, friendships that carried the weight of something deeper but remained unspoken to the public. In this world, secrecy was not cowardice, it was survival. To protect their art, to keep creating, these actresses struck a difficult bargain. They concealed what the world could not yet accept. They paid the price of silence so they could continue to shine on stage and screen. And yet, in their very concealment, they also carved space for something radical. They demonstrated that identity could not be neatly packaged, that strength could coexist with secrecy, and that even under oppressive conditions, authenticity found ways to leak through. A look, a gesture, a costume choice. Sometimes these small details said what could not be spoken aloud. Contrast that with today, where Hollywood has begun to embrace LGBTQ+ identities more openly. Stars like Jodie Foster, Kristen Stewart, and Sarah Paulson can walk red carpets with their partners, and audiences celebrate them not in spite of who they are, but because of it. Representation has grown. Stories are bolder, and visibility is no longer synonymous with career destruction. The progress we see now is built, in part, on the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before. The silence of the past laid the groundwork for the openness of today. And so, the legacy of these women is not just in their films or their performances, but in their resilience. They remind us of how much has changed, and of the cost it took to get here. For every laugh Lily Tomlin delivered, for every daring role Susan Tyrrell embodied, for every glamorous image Angie Dickinson projected, there was also the weight of secrecy pressing down. They carried that burden so that the culture, slowly, could move forward. Their stories also leave us with a sobering truth. Visibility is never guaranteed, and progress is never permanent. Each generation must fight to hold the space carved out by those before them. In looking back at the 1970s, We see not just hidden struggles, but also a reminder of the fragility of progress and the strength it takes to protect it. In the end, what we are left with is this paradox. In their silence, they carried the weight of their time. But in their art, they left behind a legacy that still speaks today. It speaks in the laughter of a Tomlin sketch, in the quiet strangeness of a Sandy Dennis performance, in the gender-bending audacity of Marlene Dietrich's tuxedo. It speaks in every role that defied convention, in every performance that hinted at a truth just beyond the frame. These women could not always live openly, but they lived brilliantly, and though their truths were often hidden, their art ensured that those truths would never be entirely erased.